It's Sunday, February 24th. Welcome to the News Diet. Today, I'm going to talk about the ongoing fallout of the train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio. I'm going to go over what exactly happened, why this crash is still being discussed now 3 weeks later, and potential long-term implications stemming from it. But before we jump in, be sure to subscribe so you can be notified of new explainers about current events coming out regularly. Every new subscriber really does help out the channel a ton, so if you do click the button, then be sure to reach out or leave a comment to let me know you did so I can thank you personally. It's now been over 3 weeks since the train derailment in the city of East Palestine, Ohio. The implications are still unfolding and people are still asking for answers. This story has quite a few layers, from toxic chemicals and public health concerns, to regulation issues, to political infighting, and lots of pointed fingers. But before we dive into all that, let's go over what exactly happened in the first place. Earlier this month, on February 3rd, a freight train by transport company Norfolk Southern derailed in the Ohio city of East Palestine, which is home to about 4,700 residents. This train consisted of about 150 cars, and the accident caused 49 of them into a derailment pile. The reason for the accident was an overheated wheel bearing. We'll get into that part a bit later, but the issue that's causing this story to still be so relevant now several weeks later is what happened immediately after the crash. You see, 20 of the cars on this train carried hazardous materials, 11 of which were involved in the wreckage. The main chemical of concern was vinyl chloride, an industrially produced colorless gas that's highly flammable. So considering the derailment also caused the eruption of a huge fire that lasted for 2 days, authorities immediately became concerned that this chemical could trigger a major explosion. So in an attempt to avoid that, they evacuated residents within a mile of the site and conducted a controlled release of 5 cars carrying the toxic fumes, which comes out to somewhere around 116,000 gallons. Now, the aftermath of all this is kind of full of conflicting reports, and by that, I mainly mean between the government agencies and local residents. After the controlled release of the chemicals, the Environmental Protection Agency claimed that it did not detect contamination levels of concern in the area. They even tested the air quality inside the homes of 400 people, saying that the quality standards were just fine. However, the EPA did call on the rail company Norfolk Southern to continue identifying and cleaning up contaminated resources like soil, water, and air. They also said that the company will be responsible for reimbursing both the EPA and residents for their trouble. But residents are claiming a different story. They've reported cases of illnesses starting right after the chemicals were released. The reports include symptoms like nausea, headaches, and rashes. There were also videos that made the rounds on social media showing discolored water as well as a bunch of washed up fish in rivers and waterways. To back that up, just last week, the Ohio Department of Natural Resources concluded that over 43,000 fish had in fact died within a 5-mile span of the crash site. Residents have voiced concerns over the drinking water, breathing the air, and even some expressed that they're likely to forego gardening or harvesting for the foreseeable future out of fear of contaminated soil. Now, on Thursday, the National Transportation Safety Board released a preliminary report of their findings over the accident. They actually didn't declare a conclusive reason for the derailment, but they did release other details. I told you I'd come back to the timeline of events of the actual crash, and this is what's revealed so far. On February 3rd, before the 9 p.m. derailment, a wheel bearing on the 23rd car quickly overheated, rising to more than 250 degrees above the outdoor temperature of just 10 degrees. This overheating set off an alarm which compelled the train's engineer to stop the train. He did so, and the 3-person crew exited the train, which is when they noticed the fire and smoke of the cars that derailed. You have to think, this train was around 150 cars long, which comes out to about 9,000 feet, which is over 1.5 miles. The report shed some light on the train's current safety measures for detecting such issues. Apparently, Norfolk Southern has defect detectors installed along the railway lines. These detectors have sensors that identify and report issues. The 3 sensors cited in the report were along 30 miles of the track and show the progress of the overheated wheel bearing. The first one recorded an overheated temperature of 38 degrees over the ambient outdoor temperature. The second sensor, 11 miles later, recorded a temperature of 103 degrees over, and the third and last sensor, 19 miles later, recorded 253 degrees degrees over, which was then considered high enough to alert the crew. But when the engineer decelerated, the wheel bearing failed. The temperature at which train operators are required to take action is at 170 degrees, and at 200 degrees, they're immediately required to stop. But there were 19 miles between the two sensors that would have caught this milestone. So one question coming out of the reports is if more sensors should have been installed. So this brings us to the political theater and blame game coming out of all of this. But before that, I did want to quickly go over some other train derailments that also happened this month, because these have just added fuel to the conversation over what the heck is going on with our rail system. So in addition to the East Palestine incident, 31 cars of a Union Pacific train carrying coal derailed, and another Union Pacific accident leaked 10,000 gallons of so-called acid-related products that called for a half-mile evacuation. And another Norfolk Southern train also carrying hazardous materials was derailed, but luckily nothing spilled. Now, one fact to point out is that while these reports are capturing a lot of media attention at the moment, the Washington Post does point out that federal data shows chemical leaks from train transport are actually on the decline. Okay, so let's get back to the political responses to East Palestine. One of the big criticisms coming out of the accident, in addition to the obvious health concerns, was the delay in public response from national leadership. It was weeks after the incident until traction was made by public officials in the White House, or even mainstream media for that matter. Neither President Biden nor Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg made big announcements or visits to the site as residents were asking for answers. In fact, last week, former President Trump made the unusual move of making a visit for himself. And I say unusual because it's not the most common thing for a former president to be visiting crisis zones when not even the current president is doing so. But Trump is at the beginning of his 2024 presidential campaign, so I'm sure a lot of that decision-making was to jump on the opportunity to criticize the Biden administration. He focused on not just their lack of presence in East Palestine, but also Biden's Ukraine trip during this time to show support for the Ukrainian people and government as it continued to fight off Russian forces. In fact, Biden's office has announced that he still doesn't have plans to visit. As for Transportation Secretary Buttigieg, his stated reason for not visiting the site was to not create distractions during recovery efforts. But coincidentally or not, the day he did end up visiting was the day right after Trump. Now, Buttigieg and the White House have pushed back on Trump's criticisms of them, claiming that it was the regulation rollbacks from his administration that contributed to these issues. They're referring to an Obama-era rule from 2015 that required trains carrying certain hazardous materials to employ advanced braking technology. But Trump repealed this rule in 2018 after his Department of Transportation concluded that the cost of installing these more sophisticated brakes outweigh the benefit. However, the New York Times quotes the head of the National Transportation Safety Board as saying that this rule wouldn't have even applied to the train in East Palestine. So, like most tragedies, both sides are trying to seize an opportunity to point blame at the other. The conversation about how this accident could have been prevented and the overall rail infrastructure issue overall is an ongoing conversation with no concrete action steps yet. And unfortunately, the same goes for East Palestine residents affected by the toxins. We might not know the full effect of the contamination for a while, and if in fact the EPA was right in saying the levels aren't as bad as locals think. You've just been informed, so now it's time to get on with your day. I'm Michelle Carroll. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the episode and want to continue following a healthier alternative for staying informed, where I forgo partisan fighting and fear-driven narratives and just get to the point, then please be sure to hit that subscribe button, as of course you'll get more of this show in your feed, and also you'll be helping this new channel grow and reject sensational media. Thank you so much for your support, and I can't wait to see you in the next episode.